how medieval England's ordinary people actually survived plagues, kings, and questionable hygiene. Boring history for sleep. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world that was colder, muddier, and noisier than anything your modern ears would tolerate. So, go ahead and dim the lights. Let your breathing slow. Maybe wrap yourself in a blanket the way a medieval peasant wrapped themselves in, well, whatever scraps of wool they hadn't already sold to pay their taxes. Because tonight, we're wandering softly, gently, into medieval England. Not the glamorous version, with sparkling castles and elegant queens posing in front of tapestries. No, we're exploring the actual experience of ordinary people, the ones who did all the real work, the ones who smelled constantly of smoke, damp hay, and the general disappointment of being born before indoor plumbing. The ones who lived through plagues, kings, wars, and winters that felt like they were personally trying to kill you. This isn't a story of knights and feasts. It's a story of survival. Quiet survival. Day after day, year after year, in a world that seldom made sense and rarely tried to. So let's begin, very softly, in a village where life trudged forward like an ox pulling a cart slightly too heavy for it. Where life actually happened. When you picture medieval England, you might imagine towering cathedrals or royal courts full of nobles whispering dramatically behind their sleeves. But for 95% of the population, life unfolded in villages, small clusters of huts surrounded by fields, forests, and the occasional confused goose. Most people lived in a single-room home made of wattle and daub, basically sticks filled with mud, because medieval architecture was built on the principle of good enough. The roof was thatched, the floor was dirt, and the insulation was optimism. Inside, families slept on straw mattresses that were frequently home to small insects who did not pay rent. Smoke from the hearth drifted upward and accumulated in dark corners, giving everything a permanent scent of slightly burned stew. If you were lucky, you shared this space with your spouse, children, and maybe one elderly relative. If you were unlucky, you also shared it with livestock, a small cow or sheep tucked inside for warmth. Imagine drifting to sleep next to your grandmother and a resentful goat, while the wind whistles through a wall you personally watched crumble last Tuesday. Welcome to medieval domestic life. Daily life. Endless chores and some bonus chores. Let's drift into a typical morning. You'd wake up at dawn, not because you wanted to, but because medieval roosters had an enthusiasm for shouting that modern alarm clocks can only aspire to. There were chores waiting. So many chores. More chores than should reasonably exist for any one human lifetime. Cows needed milking, water needed hauling, bread dough needed kneading and then forgetting about until it rose, or didn't rise, because yeast back then was a lawless force of nature. Children needed herding, tools needed repairing, clothing needed mending. Life was basically a to-do list with no bottom. Men worked the fields. Women managed the household, which in medieval terms meant doing virtually everything. Children helped wherever possible, which meant helping a little and getting underfoot a lot. And through all of it, there was mud. Medieval England was practically built on mud. It crept into your shoes, your home, your hair, your emotional stability. Villagers were resigned to it. Mud was not a problem. It was a personality trait of the landscape. Meals, a celebration of blandness. Now, let's talk about food. If you imagine medieval meals as banquets full of roasted meats and sparkling goblets, you are sadly thinking of the top 1%, A group so small, their existence barely affected the national average. For ordinary people, meals were an exercise in creative minimalism. Breakfast, a hunk of coarse bread, and maybe a cup of ale, because the water wasn't safe and hydration was not optional. Lunch, pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew made of whatever vegetables were still alive, mixed with grains, herbs, and hope. Sometimes peasants tossed in bits of salted meat, but meat was expensive, and animals were more valuable, alive. Dinner, leftover pottage, or new pottage, or pottage that was having a small identity crisis after 3 days on the fire. Flavor was not the point. Survival was. And yet, there was a quiet comfort in these meals. Warm, filling, predictable, something steady in a world full of uncertainties, plagues, and the occasional wandering tax collector. Hygiene, or something like it, let's float now into the delicate subject of cleanliness. Medieval hygiene has a reputation for being bad, very bad. The kind of bad that would make a modern dermatologist weep. But the truth is a little softer. People did wash, just not the way we do. Baths were rare, mostly because heating water was a full-body workout. Instead, people washed their hands and faces regularly. Sometimes feet. Other areas were left to the imagination. Clothing wasn't washed often, but linen undergarments were changed more regularly. Well, regularly for medieval standards, not modern ones. Your laundry routine would probably still horrify them. Still, villagers weren't walking around in filth all day, just some of the day. If you were a peasant, at least you had the fresh outdoor air. If you lived in a city, congratulations, you were surrounded by smells strong enough to obliterate your sense of optimism. But we'll drift into medieval cities later. Monarchs, far away. Frequently, confusing and occasionally dangerous, kings and queens played a distant but powerful role in the lives of medieval people. You almost never saw them. You rarely heard news about them, but you definitely felt their decisions, usually in the form of taxes. To medieval peasants, kings were something like extremely unpredictable weather patterns. You hoped they would be mild. You expected they would be inconvenient. You prayed they wouldn't start a war, because wars required money and soldiers. And guess who provided both? Some kings inspired loyalty, others inspired resignation. A few inspired active dread, usually the ones who mistook divine right for divine competence. But for most people, the monarchy was simply there, part of the background hum of life. Like thunder, or the church bell, or the neighbor who always borrowed tools and never returned them. The church. Everything. Everywhere. All the time, let's drift gently into the spiritual side of things. Religion was not a small part of medieval life. It was life. The church calendar dictated your work schedule, your diet, your celebrations, and your anxieties. Priests interpreted scripture, local gossip, weather patterns, and the moral quality of your cow. Every week, villagers attended Mass in a stone church that smelled of incense, damp stone, and a hint of mild social judgment. People found comfort there, structure, community, but also a healthy dose of fear. Sin was everywhere. The devil was a genuine occupational hazard, and death was just around the corner. Speaking of death, the plague, we cannot drift through medieval England without acknowledging the Black Death. It arrived quietly, then swiftly, then brutally. Imagine living in a village where you knew everyone, every family, every child, every cow, and suddenly half of them were gone. The plague didn't care about wealth, status, or your personal hygiene routine, which, in fairness, was already modest. It swept through towns and cities with terrifying speed. But here's the strange part. Those who survived didn't talk about it the way we do. They didn't create epic documentaries or historical analyses. They grieved. They rebuilt. They kept going. Medieval people were resilient in a way that modern humans can hardly comprehend. When life fell apart, they picked up what was left and resumed the endless rhythm of chores, not because they were emotionless, but because they didn't have a choice. Why they survived. Community. For all the hardships, plagues, kings, questionable hygiene, medieval people survived because they had each other. Villages worked together. They shared tools, food, gossip, and grief. They relied on neighbors in a world where the nearest help might be several muddy miles away. They didn't have much. Their days were long, their winters harder, their lives shorter, but they had a sense of belonging, a woven net of human connection that caught them when times were impossible. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but it was profoundly human. And as we drift deeper into their world, we'll explore the people behind this resilience, their marriages, their families, their superstitions, their strange jobs, their feuds, and their quietly heroic daily survival. But for now, breathe. Let your shoulders sink. Let your mind soften like old candle wax, delivered in small, cold buildings where the only heat came from body temperature and whatever spiritual fire the minister was attempting to summon. People attended because not attending was suspicious. And in small communities, suspicious was only one step away from accused of something. Still, these gatherings offered comfort, shared hope, shared fear, shared identity in a land that felt overwhelmingly unfamiliar. Sleep, rare, precious, and frequently interrupted, you would think. With all the physical labor settlers performed, they'd sleep like stones. They did not. Sleep was always interrupted by cold winds slipping through wall cracks, by children crying, by animals making noises, by fire embers needing tending, by weather, by fear, by someone waking up convinced they heard a bear outside, sometimes by an actual bear outside. Beds were piles of straw. And let medieval England settle around you. Mud, smoke, stubborn hope and all. What happened to people who went missing in medieval Europe? The quiet vanishings, hey everyone, tonight? We're drifting back to a world that didn't yet have the luxury of being found. A world where people could step off a muddy road and vanish forever. Where a missing person wasn't a mystery to be solved, but simply an accepted fact of life. So, take a deep breath, dim the lights. Let's drift into the fog of medieval Europe, where losing track of someone wasn't a scandal. It was just Tuesday. Disappearing was easy for most of human history. The idea of going missing required no effort at all. You didn't need a disguise, a false passport, or an alibi. You just needed to keep walking. Because medieval Europe didn't have any of the systems we take for granted. No centralized records, no police departments, no reliable maps, and very few people who could even write down a name. If you were unlucky enough to be born a peasant, which, statistically, you were, you could disappear simply by going. Over the next hill, maybe you fell into a river. Maybe you joined a passing band of traders, or Maybe you just decided that you'd rather not be Jeffrey from the Mudfields anymore. Rest of the village might talk about it for a few days. Someone would check your hut. Someone else would claim they saw your ghost. And then life would go on, because in a world full of famine, plague, war, and wolves, a missing person was only slightly more unusual than a missing chicken. The runaway serf let's start with the most common type of disappearance, the runaway serf. Serfs were peasants who were legally tied to the land, not enslaved, exactly, but close enough that the difference was mostly paperwork. If you were a serf, you couldn't leave your lord's estate without permission. You couldn't marry without his consent, and you certainly couldn't pack your sack and stroll off to a better life elsewhere, which, naturally, many people did anyway. If you were caught, you could be dragged back, fined, or even flogged, but the odds of being caught were low. Most lords couldn't be bothered to chase down a single peasant, especially one with no oxen, no tools, and no money. So, many simply slipped away into the growing medieval towns, places like London, Bruges, or Cologne. There, they could melt into the crowd, take up work as a laborer, and claim to be a free man. After a year and a day of living in a town, you officially were free. By law. The logic was simple. If your lord hadn't found you by then, he probably didn't care enough to, and so every year, thousands of medieval people vanished quietly, leaving behind their fields, their debts, and their families. The ones who went the wrong way, but not every disappearance was so deliberate. Europe in the Middle Ages was covered in dense, ancient forests, places with names like the Black Forest, or the Forest of Dean, or simply the woods, because that's all anyone needed to know. People went in to cut timber, gather herbs, or hunt, and sometimes they just didn't come out. Wolves were common, so were bears, and the occasional opportunistic outlaw. But often, the culprit was simply geography. There were no real roads, just muddy tracks that twisted between villages. You could easily get lost, especially at night, or in fog, or during one of the endless wars when landmarks were burned down. If someone didn't return, the village might send out a search party for a day or two. Then they'd assume God had decided otherwise. Sometimes the body would turn up years later, a skull under a tree root, or a leather shoe poking out of the earth. Sometimes not. In either case, the story usually ended with the same quiet shrug. It was God's will. The vanishing pilgrim. Then there were the pilgrims. Perhaps the most respectable kind of missing person. A pilgrimage was a sort of medieval gap year, except it was mostly walking and guilt. You'd travel across Europe to visit holy sites, the tomb of St. James in Spain, or the relics of St. Peter in Rome, or maybe a splinter of the true cross on display in some ambitious monastery. It sounded noble. It was also incredibly dangerous. Pilgrims were robbed, kidnapped, drowned, or died of dysentery on the road. When they failed to return home, their families assumed they'd gone straight to heaven. In fact, many people purposely vanished this way. A pilgrimage was the perfect excuse to leave behind a messy life. Bad marriage, crushing debt, awkward affair with the miller's wife? Just tell everyone you're off to see St. James, and keep walking until nobody recognizes you anymore. A few even resurfaced years later, wearing new clothes and a new name, claiming to be born again after years of holy travel, which was technically true. They'd just reinvented themselves somewhere sunnier. Lost to war, the next big category of missing people came courtesy of war, which, in medieval Europe, was basically a full-time job. Between crusades, invasions, border feuds, and noble tantrums, the continent was constantly bleeding young men into its soil. When armies marched off, there were no rolls of names, no identification tags, and no organized way to track casualties. If someone didn't return, no one could say whether he died in battle, been taken prisoner, or decided that dying in Flanders sounded less appealing than settling down in France with a local tavern keeper. Some widows waited decades. Others remarried after a few years, hoping for the best. Occasionally, a dead man would walk back into town years later, causing absolute chaos. 2 husbands, 2 families, one very confused priest. In one recorded case from 12th century Normandy, a man declared dead on crusade returned after 15 years to find his wife remarried and his farm sold. He was allowed to stay as a boarder in his own house. He died again, quietly and for real, this time 2 years later. Urban disappearances. We tend to think of medieval cities as small, cozy places. They weren't. Paris in the 14th century had over 200,000 people, and not a single police officer. If you disappeared there, no one noticed. Homelessness, disease, and crime were everywhere. Bodies were often found in rivers or ditches, and unless someone recognized the clothing, they were buried anonymously. Unknown man found near the Seine was a common entry in civic records, usually followed by disposed of. Child labor was common too, and many of the lost children of the Middle Ages were simply orphans who drifted from one city to another, scavenging or apprenticing until they disappeared into adulthood. Some joined gangs of street children. Some were taken in by monasteries. Some simply died and were forgotten. Which sounds tragic, but in the medieval mindset, it was simply life being life. When the rich went missing, When peasants went missing, the world kept turning. But when nobles vanished, that was a different story. Take Lord Lovell, the loyal supporter of King Richard III. After the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487, Lovell simply vanished. For centuries, rumors claimed he'd fled to Scotland, or drowned crossing a river, or lived out his days in secret. Then, in the 18th century, a skeleton was found in a secret chamber of his old manor house, sitting in a chair, surrounded by fine clothes and a plate of bones. Apparently, he'd hidden in his own walls and never come out. Which, in fairness, is one way to keep a low profile. Then there was Margaret of Scotland, Countess of Lennox, who disappeared in 1230 during a feud. Her enemies were blamed, then the fairies, then God. Her castle passed to another family, and that was that. The medieval legal system had a simple policy. If she's gone, she's gone. Even kings weren't immune. King Valdemar IV of Denmark vanished for months. After a military defeat in the 14th century, theories ranged from he's meditating in a monastery to he's definitely dead. When he finally reappeared, everyone agreed to pretend it had been a strategic retreat. Cenote. The ones who never existed. One of the strangest medieval disappearances was of people who may never have existed in the first place. Medieval chroniclers loved to invent figures. Saints, martyrs, missing heirs, to fill gaps in their stories. Over time, those inventions became real people in local folklore. Villages would hold festivals for saints who had never been alive, much less disappeared. They'd tell stories of noble knights who went missing in the forest and would one day return. Arthurian legend is full of this idea. The sleeping hero, who isn't dead, just waiting. In a world with few certainties, it was comforting to imagine that the missing might come back. Someday, when the kingdom needed them most. The bureaucracy of the vanished. Every now and then, someone did care enough to document a disappearance, usually because of property. If a landowner went missing, his lands were held in royal custody until an heir could be found. This could drag on for decades. Enter the impostors. A missing nobleman was an open invitation for creative opportunists. A few years later, a stranger might arrive claiming to be the long-lost heir. No one could prove otherwise. In France, one 14th-century man named Arnaud Dutil successfully impersonated a missing farmer. Martin Guerre, for years, living with Martin's wife, taking over his estate and charming the entire village. Until the real Martin Guerre showed up again. It did not end well for the impostor. He was hanged for fraud, and everyone quietly agreed that maybe next time they'd ask for ID. Satinit, the piece of forgetting. For the medieval world, missing wasn't a category. It was a condition of life. People disappeared into war, into poverty, into forests, or into the monastery gates. What happened to royal mistresses when they got old? Faded roses and forgotten titles tonight? We're drifting back to a softer, slower century, the kind that smelled faintly of candle smoke, rose water, and questionable hygiene. And we're going to talk about something the history books rarely linger on. What happened to royal mistresses when the music stopped? The gilded ladies of Europe's royal courts adored one decade and ignored the next, when the kings they served, or perhaps serviced, grew bored or old, or died inconveniently early. What became of the women who had once ruled the bedchamber, and, sometimes, the kingdom? So, get comfortable, because tonight we're sinking into the velvet-lined melancholy of power that fades, beauty that wilts, and the quietly humiliating afterlives of women who once made kings kneel. Sinmantinkun, the royal mistress, Europe's most fragile job. Title being a royal mistress was never meant to be a career. It was a performance, a precarious role perched somewhere between celebrity, concubine, and unpaid political advisor. Mistresses didn't get contracts. They got jewels, estates, and whispered promises that lasted exactly as long as the monarch's attention span, which, historically speaking, was not long. To keep their position, they needed to be charming, clever, beautiful, and, most of all, useful. But youth was their real currency, and it depreciated very quickly. One day, you're the darling of Versailles. The next, you're sitting in a country estate with a gout-ridden spaniel and a fading portrait, wondering if the king even remembers your name. Still, in the glittering machinery of monarchy, mistresses played a crucial role. They were distractions, diplomats, spies, scapegoats, and sometimes the only people who could actually make a king listen to reason, which makes it all the more tragic when we remember that nearly all of them ended their lives alone, sidelined or quietly exiled. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's begin with the French, because of course we will. They practically invented professional mistressing. France, the kingdom of perfume, politics, and petty jealousy. France in the 17th and 18th centuries treated royal mistresses like state officials. They even had titles, maîtresse en titre, or official mistress, a position of influence so public it came with a staff, a budget, and an unofficial dress code, diamonds or death. The most famous was Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of Louis XV, born Jeanne Poisson. Yes, Jeanne Fish. She somehow rose from bourgeois obscurity to become the uncrowned queen of France. She wasn't the king's great love. She was his manager, She arranged entertainments, advised on politics, and eventually, when her health failed, found him new mistresses herself, which is either selfless or deeply depressing, depending on how you look at it. Pompadour was brilliant enough to transition from lover to friend. When her romantic usefulness expired, she reinvented herself as Louis's confidant and cultural advisor. She built palaces, sponsored artists, and turned gossip into governance. Still, even she couldn't defy mortality. As she aged, she became increasingly ill, and the court, which once revolved around her, moved on. She died in 1764, exhausted, pale, and just 42 years old. Louis XV, too polite to attend funerals, reportedly watched her coffin depart through the palace window and said softly, "She won't have to wait for the rain to stop," which, for a man famous for his affairs, was practically romantic. The next in line, Madame du Barry, no king, stayed faithful to the idea of monogamy for long, and Louis XV was no exception. After Pompadour's death, he turned to Madame du Barry, a woman of dazzling beauty, questionable manners, and absolutely no patience for aristocratic snobbery. Du Barry had begun life as a milliner's assistant, which in 18th-century Paris was a polite term for sometimes prostitute. She was witty, earthy, and looked good in diamonds, which, in Versailles, was practically a resume. The king adored her, but the rest of the court treated her like a contagious rash. Even the queen refused to speak to her. Still, she ruled the royal bedroom for nearly a decade. Then came the inevitable. Louis XIII died of smallpox in 1774. Du Barry's power evaporated overnight. Within hours, she was ordered to leave Versailles. The jewels, the apartments, the silks, all gone. She spent her later years in semi-exile, growing roses and trying to stay out of politics. Unfortunately, politics had other plans. When the French Revolution arrived, her reputation as the king's whore came back to haunt her. She was arrested, tried and guillotined in 1793, wearing, according to legend, a necklace she'd once received from the king. It's a rather grim ending. But then again, Versailles had always been a theater, and Du Barry, to the very end, refused to leave the stage quietly. England. Mistresses and morality across the Channel. England took a different approach. The English adored gossip, but they also adored pretending they didn't. So while the French flaunted their royal affairs, the English preferred to wrap theirs in moral excuses. Advisors, companions, ladies of the bedchamber. But make no mistake, they had mistresses. And like their French counterparts, those women's fates were rarely kind. Take Barbara Villiers, mistress to King Charles II. She was everything Restoration England loved and loathed. Beautiful, loud, manipulative, and extremely Catholic. She bore 6 of the king's children, spent staggering amounts of money, and wielded power with the grace of a bull in a lace shop. When Charles died in 1685, Barbara's influence vanished overnight. Her debts were enormous. Her enemies gleeful. She retreated to the countryside, living out her days in eccentric isolation, by which I mean she occasionally assaulted servants and accused strangers of witchcraft. By the time she died, her beauty, once described as blinding, had become a kind of punchline. Her contemporary, Nell Gwynn, managed a softer landing, a former orange seller turned actress. She became the king's favorite precisely because she didn't take herself too seriously. When asked about her rival mistresses, Nell famously called herself the Protestant whore, which, for 17th century England, was practically branding genius. Unlike Barbara, Nell never fell from grace entirely. She lived modestly after the king's death and was granted a pension for her loyalty. She died in 1687, beloved by the public, a rare, almost happy ending in a genre that didn't offer many, the price of staying beautiful. Let's pause for a moment on the universal problem every royal mistress faced: time. Even the most adored courtesan could only stretch her youth so far. Cosmetics were primitive. Skin care involved mercury, vinegar, and blind optimism, and the court, which worshipped beauty, had no patience for decay. Once a woman's looks began to fade, so did her invitations, her influence, and her access to royal favor. Some tried to fight it with elegance, shifting from seductress to wise counselor. Others simply retired before they could be replaced. A few, like Madame de Maintenon, managed to turn their positions into something more permanent. She became Louis XIV's secret wife, a neat solution to the aging problem. But most were not so lucky. Old age for a royal mistress was a sort of slow erasure. The jewels stayed in portraits, but not on the body. The gossip moved on to younger women, and history, always cruelly efficient, remembered them only as footnotes to more famous men. The mistress as scapegoat. There was one other fate common to aging mistresses, becoming the villain of the story. When things went wrong, wars, scandals, economic collapse, the public rarely blamed the king. They blamed her. Mistresses were easy targets, visible, female, and conveniently immoral. If taxes rose, it was her fault. If the king ignored his ministers, she must have bewitched him. And when the monarch died, leaving the country in shambles, she became the convenient face of corruption. Madame de Pompadour was accused of everything from causing wars to poisoning ministers. Barbara. Villiers was called the curse of England. Even mistresses who had long retired found themselves dragged back into public hatred when the crown needed someone to blame. It's ironic. The women who once whispered in kings' ears became symbols of decadence to justify rebellion. Their power was always borrowed, and the bill always came due. The retirement plan, of course, not all endings were tragic. Some royal mistresses negotiated excellent retirement packages. They were given estates, titles, and generous pensions, often to ensure their silence more than their comfort. Many lived out quiet lives managing their households, dabbling in religion, or cultivating gardens with suspiciously expensive fountains. Madame de Pompadour left behind the Petit Trianon, the exquisite little palace that would later belong to Marie Antoinette. Nell Gwyn's sons were granted noble titles, ensuring her legacy lived on in polite society. But the pattern remained. Once the crown moved on, so did the world. The glitter faded, the court forgot, and the former mistress became a curiosity. A story whispered over wine, often more fiction than fact. The soft ending. There's something almost tender about how quietly most of them disappeared. After lives lived at the center of attention, they faded into the countryside, into prayer, into obscurity. Their portraits yellowed in dusty halls. Their letters, once so carefully written, were burned by embarrassed descendants. They were, in their own strange way, part of the machinery of power, just as necessary and just as disposable. The morning after the crown tonight, we're drifting back through the soft candlelight of royal bedrooms, where the air still smells faintly of rose water, power, and regret. So, settle in, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself a cup of something warm, because we're about to explore a very particular kind of historical tragedy. One wrapped in silk sheets and sealed with a wax stamp. This is the story of what happened to royal mistresses after the king got bored. It's one of those historical questions that's equal parts awkward and fascinating. Because for centuries, royal courts were like high-stakes reality shows, filled with alliances, rivalries, whispered gossip, and people pretending not to hear what they definitely heard through a curtain. And right in the center of it all was the mistress. She was the confidant, the ornament, the rumor magnet. She was the one who could whisper into the ear of power or be dismissed with a purse of gold and a polite, "Do not return." But what did happen when the crown turned cold? When the attention faded, the king moved on, or someone younger, prettier, or politically more convenient appeared. Well, sometimes it went surprisingly well, and other times, let's just say you wouldn't want to trade places with her. Let's drift first to France, because of course we're starting in France. No, one did royal mistresses quite like the French. the profession of being beloved by the time we reached the court of Louis XIV. The position of royal mistress had become almost professionalized. There were official mistresses. They had titles, apartments, staff, sometimes even budgets larger than ministries. Louis XIV, the Sun King, because of course he had several over his long career. He treated mistresses not just as lovers, but as accessories to his monarchy. The most famous was Madame de Montespan, witty, sharp-tongued, beautiful, and extremely aware of how much power a clever woman could wield in a gilded cage. She wasn't content with flowers and compliments. She got involved in politics, patronage, and, famously, a scandal involving black masses and alleged love potions. It was called the Affair of the Poisons. And if you're imagining a Versailles version of Desperate Housewives, you're not wrong. For a while, Montespan reigned supreme. She bore Louis several children, attended every ceremony, and was referred to as maîtresse en titre, the official mistress. A title that says, yes, we're sinning, but at least it's organized. But time is unkind to everyone, even to the Sun King's chosen. As she aged, Louis began to prefer the quiet, religious Madame de Maintenon, who, unlike Montespan, did not host candle-lit poison parties. When the affair faded, Montespan wasn't exactly tossed into the gutter. This was Versailles, not a tavern. But she did retreat from court, quietly, and spent the rest of her life doing charitable works. That's often how these stories end. Devotion replacing indulgence, piety as a kind of retirement plan for the morally complicated. She donated to convents, visited hospitals, and gave speeches about repentance. It was very fashionable, because in France, fallen favorites often found religion just in time to be buried respectably. Not everyone landed softly, but not all mistresses got the charity fund ending. Some ended in something closer to obscurity with embroidery. Take Madame du Barry, the last great royal mistress of France, who belonged to Louis XV, the one just before the Revolution made royal romance less fashionable. Du Barry started out humble. Born Jeanne Bécu, she was a commoner who rose to become the king's favorite thanks to her beauty, charm, and an alarming lack of self-preservation. She was delightful. She was radiant. And she was widely hated by everyone who thought power should come from lineage, not cheekbones. When Louis XV died, Jeanne lost everything. She was banished from Versailles almost immediately, because nothing tarnishes a new reign like the lingering perfume of your predecessor's mistress. She spent years in quiet exile, living on her jewels and memories. Then, unfortunately, came the Revolution. And being associated with the old regime was not ideal resume material. she was arrested, accused of crimes against the state, which, roughly translated, meant having once been rich and charming. In 1793, she was executed by guillotine, reportedly pleading with her executioner to spare her just one more moment. A reminder that royal favor could buy you diamonds, but not permanence. Across the Channel, England's parallel world now, let's drift softly across the Channel to England, where mistresses were handled differently, less official perhaps, but just as dangerous. In the 17th and 18th centuries, English kings collected mistresses the way modern influencers collect sponsorship deals, publicly, proudly, and with mixed results. Charles II was the undisputed champion. He had mistresses from every class and temperament: actresses, courtiers, noblewomen, and probably a few who just happened to wander by. But one stands out: Nell Gwynn, the actress who started selling oranges in the theater before she began entertaining the audience in other ways. Nell was quick, funny, and completely unapologetic. She was loved by the public, which was rare for a royal mistress. While others tried to act respectable, Nell leaned into her role with a wink. She called herself the Protestant whore, because people were already saying it, so why not own the brand? When Charles died, she was left without his protection. But, miraculously, she survived. She wasn't executed, banished, or even disgraced. She was given a modest pension and lived quietly until her death. It's almost wholesome in a very unroyal way. Her secret? Probably that she never pretended to be more than she was, a rare and underrated talent at court. When love became a political appointment, but not all mistresses could afford such humility. Some were treated as political pawns, their romance with the king carefully arranged to cement alliances. Take Barbara Palmer, another of Charles II's mistresses. She was beautiful, rich, and had the political subtlety of a canon. She manipulated court factions, had 6 children by Charles, and spent money as if it were printed exclusively for her. When Charles eventually grew tired of her temper, Barbara refused to fade quietly. She continued showing up, demanding favors, and insulting his other mistresses. It got so awkward that even Charles, who once said, "I am a great king, but I am also a man," eventually gave up and distanced himself. Barbara, however, didn't crumble. She married a younger man, converted to Catholicism for a while, just to annoy people, and kept her titles. So, yes, she outlasted most. But her reputation, a mixture of awe, fear, and scandal, became her legacy. Even Samuel Pepys, who loved gossip more than food, called her the most impudent woman alive. Falling out of fashion by the 19th century, royal mistresses were less about power and more about nostalgia. The world was modernizing, and monarchies were desperately trying to look respectable. In Britain, Queen Victoria made morality fashionable again, which put an end to public mistresses, at least officially. But behind the lace curtains, the tradition quietly persisted. Her son, Edward VII, had a small army of mistresses, though he preferred discretion over drama. One of his favorites was Lily Langtry, the actress whose beauty made her a kind of Victorian celebrity before the word existed. When Edward got bored, as he inevitably did, Lily didn't fall apart. She became a businesswoman, a racehorse owner, and even an actress in America. She turned a royal rejection into a brand. So, yes, a mistress could recover. But it depended entirely on timing, personality, and whether she had a plan for life after candlelight. The art of leaving gracefully. Because here's the truth. When the king stopped calling, there was no handbook, no how to retire from adultery pamphlet. Some women took vows, some took lovers, some just took whatever jewels they could carry and moved somewhere warmer. Madame de Pompadour, perhaps the most famous mistress in European history, managed to do something almost miraculous. She stayed powerful after the romance ended. She began as Louis XV's mistress, charming, intelligent, and politically savvy, but when their physical relationship cooled, she simply pivoted. She became his closest friend and advisor. She hosted salons, influenced art and architecture, and kept her apartments in Versailles until her death. She reinvented herself as indispensable. It's hard not to admire the sheer elegance of that move. She played the long game, and she won, at least by 18th century standards. The afterglow of infamy, but fame, as ever, comes with a shadow. Many of these women were blamed for the moral decay of their courts. They were symbols of excess, decadence, and temptation, convenient scapegoats for the sins of men in crowns. Yet, without them, royal history would be far less interesting. They shaped art, fashion, and politics. They introduced new ideas, new tastes, new scandals. Courtiers who once bowed now whispered. Friends became strangers. Even servants might vanish overnight. It's a reminder that proximity to power is not the same as security. In many cases, it's the exact opposite. A bedtime reflection. So, what happened to royal mistresses when the king got bored? Some retired in luxury. Some found religion. Some lost their heads. Literally. Most faded quietly into the soft blur of history. Their portraits still hang in gilded frames, looking serene, but those eyes, They've seen the rise and fall of affection, the flicker of candlelight in rooms where love was just another transaction, vanishing in the Middle Ages, the disappeared and the forgotten tonight. We're drifting back to a time when you could vanish simply by walking down the wrong muddy road. So, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. Let's settle in with something slow and a little unsettling. The story of what happened to people who went missing in medieval Europe, before newspapers, before police, before missing posters on lampposts. If you were gone, you were just gone. You might have been eaten by wolves, or pressed into an army, or simply decided you'd rather be someone else. And unless someone happened to stumble across your bones later, or recognized you living under another name, the world simply adjusted around your absence. The Middle Ages had a strange relationship with disappearance. To us, it sounds like a tragedy, but to them, it was just another part of life. Like bad harvests, plague, or your neighbor suddenly deciding to become a monk because he'd had a vision. Let's start there, with the most common kind of medieval vanishing, the voluntary kind. Petitchendon, the disappearing peasant. Imagine it's 1283. You're a tenant farmer in a little English village called something like Much Mudford, because it's both muddy and not very imaginative. You've spent your entire life tilling land that doesn't belong to you, paying rent to a man who has never held a shovel, and eating stew so thin it barely qualifies as food. Then, one morning, you simply don't show up. Maybe you've had enough. Maybe your landlord's new steward is cruel. Or maybe you've heard rumors of better land 2 valleys over. Whatever the reason, your neighbors wake up, see your empty hut, and say, "Well, he's gone." And that's the end of it. There were no missing person reports, no organized search parties. At best, your absence might be noted in the manor rolls, the local record of who owes what. It might say, "John, tenant of the South Field, fled. His oxen seized by the reeve." That was it. Your entire disappearance reduced to a fine. The runaway and the law, but not everyone who left got away with it. If you were a serf, you were legally tied to your lord's land. Leaving without permission was technically theft, because you were considered part of the property. If you vanished, your lord could send men to drag you back. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't bother. It depended on how useful you were. Those who escaped often disappeared into towns, where anonymity was surprisingly easy. Medieval cities like London, Paris, or Cologne were full of transients, beggars, laborers, ex-soldiers, and people who just wanted to start over. After a year and a day in a town, a runaway serf could claim freedom, which meant that, legally, you were no longer missing, just reinvented. Many vanished peasants turned up later as craftsmen, servants, or soldiers, their pasts forgotten, their names slightly altered. Thomas from Mudford became Thomas of St. John's Lane, and no one asked too many questions. Pointeef, the lost and the wild, of course. Not everyone who disappeared did so by choice. Medieval Europe was full of forests, vast, dark, and often fatal. People went into them to gather firewood or hunt rabbits, and sometimes simply didn't come out again. The medieval imagination filled those woods with spirits, outlaws, and devils. But the truth was more mundane, and often worse. Wolves were common, so were bandits, and there was no GPS, no clear paths, and no real maps outside of vague sketches in monastery archives. If you got lost, that was usually the end of the story. Your body might be found months later, or not at all. And when something was found, a skull, a shoe, a tuft of hair, the village priest might quietly bury it near the churchyard wall, muttering a few words about souls gone astray. There are even recorded cases of villages holding mass funerals for the missing, just to help everyone move on. People would process through town with candles, chanting for those whom God alone knows the fate of, which, in medieval logic, was everyone. The saintly disappearance. Now, let's drift to another kind of vanishing, the holy kind. Because if you disappeared for religious reasons, that wasn't seen as a tragedy. It was almost admirable. Medieval Europe was full of people who felt the urge to wander in search of salvation. Pilgrims, hermits, and the occasional overly dramatic monk. They would leave home with nothing but a walking stick, a shell pinned to their cloak, and an alarming level of confidence. Some reached Rome or Jerusalem. Many did not. If they vanished along the way, people often assumed it was divine will. Perhaps they'd been taken into heaven, or chosen for sainthood, or eaten by bandits, all spiritually valid possibilities. One English chronicler in the 12th century wrote about a man who left on pilgrimage and was not heard of again, which was taken as a sign of his sanctity. Yes, disappearing was sometimes considered a miracle. There's something oddly comforting in that. If you went missing, people didn't necessarily think the worst. They might even pray to you. The reinvention game. But what about those who disappeared on purpose, to start over entirely? Medieval records are full of false identities, especially among monks, soldiers, and runaway spouses. If your marriage was unbearable, or you'd committed a crime, or you simply couldn't pay your debts, you might reinvent yourself under a new name a few towns away. Paperwork was minimal. Literacy was rare, and people looked very similar when covered in dirt and wool. You could walk 20 miles, claim to be a pilgrim from Normandy, and no one would argue. That's how. Occasionally, bigamists, fugitive priests, or disgraced nobles managed to live entire second lives undetected. A few even became famous, only for their real identities to be discovered later in scandalous fashion. One such case happened in 14th century Italy, where a monk named Brother Pietro turned out to be an escaped murderer from Florence. When asked why he'd chosen monastic life, he said, "To save my soul and avoid hanging." Both reasonable motivations. Sint. The vanished nobility now, while peasants disappeared constantly, the rich were another matter. If they went missing, everyone noticed, but that didn't mean anyone found them. Take Margaret, Countess of Lennox, in 13th century Scotland. She vanished during a border feud, and no one ever found her remains. Her disappearance was blamed, in turn, on witches, fairies, and a rival nobleman who definitely didn't help his case by suddenly acquiring her castle, or King Valdemar IV of Denmark, who vanished for months after a military defeat in 1349. Rumors spread that he'd gone mad and was living as a hermit. In truth, he was probably sulking in exile. But the legend stuck. And then there's Lord Lovell, a supporter of Richard III, who disappeared after the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487. Centuries later, a skeleton was found hidden in a secret chamber of his ancestral manor, still wearing fine clothes, as though he'd crawled in and never come out. He became one of those haunting medieval morality tales, loyal to the wrong cause, loyal to the last breath. Of course, being found centuries later in a wall cavity is quite an ending. Most nobles didn't even get that. War, pilgrimage, and lost at sea. War was another excellent way to vanish. Medieval armies had no dog tags, no organized records. If you fell in battle and no one recognized your body, that was it. Families might wait years before declaring you dead. Some widows never remarried, clinging to the faint hope that their husbands were alive somewhere, serving another lord, or maybe held captive. Occasionally, they were. The Crusades in particular created thousands of mysterious disappearances. Men left for the Holy Land and simply never returned. Letters might arrive years later, or not at all. In England, so many husbands vanished overseas that the church had to issue special rulings on what counted as proof of death. Usually it came down to, has anyone seen him in the last 7 years? If not, the wife could remarry. Though, if the husband later showed up, things got complicated. There's a record from 1221 of a woman who remarried after her husband's presumed death on crusade, only for him to return 6 years later, furious and penniless. The church's verdict? She must return to her first husband. Her second marriage was declared invalid, and everyone involved was told to pray more, which was, as usual, the solution to everything. The missing and the mystical disappearances weren't just seen as accidents. They were sometimes interpreted as supernatural events. If a child vanished, it might be said the fairies had taken them, replaced with a changeling. This belief lasted for centuries, and, tragically, people acted on it. There are court records from Ireland and Scotland as late as the 16th century, describing parents accused of harming their children in attempts to force the fairies to return. The real one. Adults could vanish into legend, too. Hermits, who went into the forest to pray, were sometimes said to have been taken up by angels, which sounds poetic, but probably meant eaten by something. Still, the idea of a person stepping out of the known world and into another, into sainthood, or the fairy realm, or divine mystery, was oddly comforting to medieval minds. It made disappearance part of the cosmic story, not just a sad accident. The bureaucracy of the missing it might surprise you that the medieval world did have paperwork for missing people, but only when property was involved. If a landowner vanished, the crown often seized their estate until the rightful heir be found. This led to a thriving business in pretenders, people claiming to be the long-lost heir returning home. How did medieval people really smell? A fragrant beginning tonight. We're drifting back to a world that smelled a bit different. Not necessarily worse, though yes, sometimes worse, but simply different. Because the Middle Ages had its own palette of scents, a blend of wood smoke, valentines, sweat, beeswax, damp wool, horse, and hope. So if you've ever wondered whether medieval people were as filthy as the movies suggest, tonight we're going to find out. And we'll do it gently, like easing open the door of a 14th century cottage, letting the smell of humanity drift in and trying not to make a face. So settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe light a candle, if you like the historical accuracy, and let's drift back to a time before deodorant, before indoor plumbing, before the word hygiene was even invented, and find out what medieval Europe actually smelled like. The smell of everyday life. Let's start with the obvious question. Did people smell bad? The short answer is probably yes, but the long answer is more interesting. You see, medieval people didn't think in terms of good or bad smells the way we do. They lived in a world of natural odors, the scent of bodies, animals, wood smoke, and the earth were simply part of life, not something to hide. In fact, the modern obsession with smelling like nothing at all would have struck them as very strange. To a medieval person, the idea of masking your body's natural aroma might have seemed suspicious, almost deceitful. After all, If you didn't smell like a person, what were you? Bathing, or the lack thereof now. Let's talk about bathing, because this is where most misconceptions come in. People imagine the Middle Ages as a 1,000-year stretch of unwashed peasants rolling in mud. But that's not entirely fair. Medieval Europeans did bathe, just not every day and not always alone. In towns and cities, public bathhouses were common. You'd go there with your friends, your spouse, or, if you were unlucky, your co-workers. They were usually clean, steamy, and, depending on the location, occasionally doubled as brothels. But before we judge too harshly, remember that for much of Europe's early medieval period, the idea of washing regularly was seen as civilized, even pious. Charlemagne himself was famously fond of baths. He'd spend hours soaking while discussing politics with his advisors, a medieval version of a conference. Call in a hot tub, and monastic. Communities were surprisingly clean. Monks were required to wash their hands before meals, and some abbeys even had indoor plumbing. Rudimentary, yes, but functional. So where does the myth of the filthy medieval person come from? Mostly from later periods, when public bathhouses were shut down during plagues or condemned as sinful by church reformers. Because naturally, when something is fun, the church eventually got suspicious. Soap and water as for soap. Yes, they had it. It was just rougher. Early soap was made from animal fat and lye, sometimes scented with herbs like rosemary or sage. Not exactly a luxury product, but for those who could afford it, there were imported soaps from the Mediterranean. Smoother, milder, and sometimes perfumed with olive oil. These were prized possessions, often kept in linen chests with clothing to keep moths away and leave a pleasant scent. Still, most ordinary people relied on water alone, or a simple washcloth and a bucket. It wasn't that they didn't want to be clean, it's just that cleanliness took work. Firewood had to be chopped. Water had to be heated. Tubs had to be filled. If you've ever lived through a power outage, you can sympathize. The layers problem clothing also played a role in the medieval aroma. People wore multiple layers of fabric. Linen undergarments, wool tunics, outer cloaks, and they didn't change them often. Linen was washable, but wool was not, so the linen absorbed sweat, oil, and whatever else daily life offered. The outer layers trapped it in, and voila, the scent of humanity, preserved for generations. Still, the idea that everyone constantly reeked of rotten filth isn't accurate. Most people were. Used to the smell of sweat and earth, they noticed dirt differently, not as uncleanliness, but as part of being alive. In fact, they might have thought we smell strange. All detergents and artificial fruit. To them, we'd probably smell faintly of medicine. The noble nose among the upper classes However, smell was a serious matter. Nobles didn't necessarily bathe more often, but they had access to luxuries that helped them smell cleaner. Perfumed oils, rosewater, and herbal sachets were popular. They lined their gloves and sleeves with dried lavender or cloves. They burned incense in their chambers, and they sprinkled their clothing with powdered orris root, which smells like violets and is, incidentally, the root of the iris flower. There were also pomanders, little metal orbs filled with fragrant herbs, worn around the neck or tucked into belts. They looked beautiful and, conveniently, helped you survive a crowded banquet hall without passing out. Because, make no mistake, medieval banquets were stinky. Imagine 50 people eating roasted meat with their hands in a hall filled with smoke, wine, and damp fur cloaks. You'd need a pomander just to stay conscious, and when the air got too thick, nobles would simply open a window, or, more often, ask a servant to do it. Cities of scent. The real problem wasn't people's personal hygiene, it was urban hygiene. Medieval cities smelled lively, streets doubled as sewers. People emptied chamber pots from upper windows, sometimes without checking below. Open markets sold fish and meat in the sun, and animals were everywhere. Horses, pigs, chickens, dogs. So, yes, cities stank. But people didn't notice it as much as we might. Smells were just part of the landscape, like weather. You didn't complain about it. You adapted to it. Many city dwellers even developed a kind of scent-based map of their surroundings. You'd know you were near the tannery by the sharp smell of urine and lime, the bakeries by the yeasty warmth, and the fish market by, well, you can imagine. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar. Home smelled like home, even if home smelled faintly of goat. The Science of Smell. Medieval edition now. Medieval people did have theories about smell. They believed that bad odors could literally make you sick, that disease floated through the air as miasma. It wasn't entirely wrong. Before germ theory, smell was often the only clue that something was rotten or contagious. So to protect themselves, people surrounded their noses with pleasant scents. The medieval version of wearing a mask. Doctors stuffed herbs into the beaks of plague. Masks, wealthy citizens burned aromatic woods or carried bunches of herbs called posies, and entire streets might be fumigated with incense during outbreaks. It didn't stop the plague, of course, but it probably made the experience slightly more bearable. Peasants in the fields. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, things smelled more natural. Peasants worked outdoors, surrounded by animals, crops, and earth. Their scents were seasonal. Hay in summer, smoke in winter, mud all year round. They washed in rivers or ponds when they could, and their clothes, though simple, were made of breathable fabrics that aired out easily. It wasn't glamorous, but it wasn't squalid either. You might have smelled the faint tang of wood ash, a byproduct of homemade soap, or the comforting scent of straw. And yes, probably some manure. But that, too, was normal. In many ways, rural life was cleaner than urban life, not because peasants were tidier, but because they had more space and fresher air. The fragrant church, one of the most unexpectedly pleasant-smelling places in medieval Europe, was the church. Think about it. Stone walls cooled the air. Candles filled it with beeswax, and incense burned constantly during Mass. It must have smelled rich and heavy, like honey, smoke, and sanctity. For people whose homes smelled of livestock and stew, walking into a cathedral would have been a sensory experience. Overwhelming. Even the air alone might have felt holy. And it's no coincidence that churches became associated with cleanliness and moral purity. They literally smelled better than everything else. Romance and hygiene. Let's drift for a moment into the awkward world of medieval romance, because you might be wondering, how did anyone fall in love under these conditions? Well, for starters, the nose wasn't quite as judgmental then. A whiff of sweat might signal hard work or vitality, both attractive qualities. And perfume was seen as luxurious, not necessary. Medieval love poetry is full of scent imagery. Roses, violets, musk, ambergris, but those were ideals, not expectations. Real people probably smelled like warm linen and damp wool, which, honestly, is kind of cozy. Still, the wealthy went to great lengths to maintain their allure. They washed their faces with rose water, they chewed cloves to freshen their breath, and, occasionally, they bathed in wine or milk, which sounds decadent, but was probably sticky and awful. One 15th century beauty manual even recommended rubbing the skin with pigeon water, distilled from actual pigeons. So, yes, people experimented, sometimes disastrously. The royal stench, even royalty wasn't immune to odor. Castles looked grand, but smelled terrible. They were drafty, smoky, and full of people, nobles, servants, dogs, guards, cooks. Sanitation was minimal. Waste was dumped in cesspits or moats, and ventilation was not a strong medieval concept. Henry VIII's palaces, for instance, required teams of men just to manage the latrines. The fine art of dying inconveniently tonight. We're drifting back to a time before passports, fingerprints, or awkward photo IDs, a time when, if life got a bit too complicated, say you owed too much money, married too many people, or accidentally annoyed a king, there was always one last, slightly dramatic option left: You could die, or at least pretend to. So, fluff your pillow, dim the lights, and let's slip quietly into the strange, sleepy world of fake deaths before modern identification existed, where bodies were optional, alibis were elastic, and truth was something that depended mostly on who was writing the parish records. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that people have always been willing to lie, especially when the alternative involves debtor's prison, public humiliation, or a small army of angry creditors at your door. Before photography, before telegraphs, before centralized record-keeping, the world was astonishingly easy to disappear in. You could sail to another country and call yourself something slightly exotic, like John Smith from Flanders, and no one would question it, mostly because no one had ever been to Flanders. But of course, some people took the more theatrical route, the faked death, the noble art of going missing in the Middle Ages. People didn't exactly fake deaths the way we imagine it today. There were no staged car crashes or convenient insurance policies. Instead, they simply left. One day, you're a disgraced monk, or a nobleman with gambling debts, or a husband who really doesn't want to go back home. And the next, you're a humble pilgrim on the road to Santiago, or maybe a hermit named Brother Gregory, who definitely isn't the same guy wanted for fraud in Norwich. Identity was fluid. Paperwork was rare, and corpses, when they appeared, were generally taken at face value, sometimes literally. The proof of death could be as simple as someone saying, "Yes, I saw him drown," while everyone nodded sympathetically and moved on. And while most of these vanishing acts were mundane, deserters, debtors, and monks having second thoughts about celibacy, a few were elaborate enough to earn a place in history. Let's start with a royal one. The case of the vanishing King I of the earliest famous death fakers was King Sebastian of Portugal. In 1578, he charged into battle against the Moors in Morocco, young, reckless, and tragically overconfident. His army was crushed, and Sebastian was supposedly killed in the chaos, only no one ever found the body. You can imagine what happened next. Within months, rumors began swirling. He had survived. He was coming back. He'd just gone into hiding to prepare for a glorious return. And because this was the 16th century, and people loved a good resurrection story, the myth grew into a national obsession. It even became a movement, Sebastianism, a kind of mystical belief that the missing king would someday return to save Portugal. Of course, this also meant that a steady parade of fake Sebastians began showing up across Europe. At least 4 separate men claimed to be the missing monarch over the next few decades. One was a wandering monk, another was an Italian, who'd read too much and decided to give destiny a try. All of them were very persuasive, at least until the authorities started asking awkward questions like, "Donnersteins, ma din Schoestetter twins. If you're the king, why don't you speak Portuguese?" But the idea of the hidden king, alive somewhere, watching, waiting, was too romantic to die. Portugal clung to it for centuries, and in a strange way, that's what happens when you live in a time before photographs. Truth can simply fade. You can become a legend without even trying. Monks, merchants, and men who just walked away, of course. Not everyone who faked their death did it for prophecy. Some just needed a break. Take the medieval monk, an archetype of quiet piety, right? Except that monastic life was often repetitive, restrictive, and filled with rules about when and how you could speak, eat, or even look out the window. So, many monks, surprisingly many, ran away. But leaving a monastery without permission was technically illegal, a kind of spiritual desertion, and rather than face punishment, some monks simply died. Their brothers would report it in good faith. Brother Thomas drowned during pilgrimage, or succumbed to illness on the road, and meanwhile, the very much alive Brother Thomas would be found years later, married, running a shop, or starting an entirely new life under a suspiciously similar name like Thomas de Nata Monk. It happened often enough that church authorities had to start keeping more detailed registers, not to prevent sin, but to prevent accounting errors, because nothing ruins an abbey's reputation like the sudden resurrection of a monk who was supposed to be buried in the back garden. The desertion dilemma by the 17th and 18th centuries. As armies got larger and wars dragged on, another class of fake deaths appeared. The disappearing soldiers. Military desertion was a serious crime, often punishable by death, so soldiers developed an array of creative exit strategies. Some would leave behind personal items, a hat, a boot, a blood-stained shirt, near a riverbank or battlefield, hoping everyone would assume the worst. Others bribed doctors to sign fake death certificates, especially during outbreaks of plague or typhus. There were even cases of soldiers deliberately joining hospitals for the dying, then slipping out under the cover of night and letting their names be listed among the deceased. And because communication between regiments was glacial, it often worked. A man could die in Flanders and reappear 2 years later in the colonies with a new name, a wife, and absolutely no military record. Today, that sounds like a logistical nightmare. Back then, it was just Tuesday. When royalty tried to cheat death now, sometimes faked deaths weren't just personal escape plans, they were political theater. One of the most famous examples comes from Russia, the case of false Dmitri. When Tsar Ivan the Terrible died, His young son Dmitri supposedly perished in a suspicious accident, the kind that happens when rival nobles are nearby with sharp objects. Years later, a mysterious man appeared claiming to be Dmitri, miraculously alive, conveniently grown up, and ready to reclaim the throne. He gained followers, charmed nobles, and actually became Tsar in 1605. Unfortunately, his reign lasted less than a year before he was overthrown and killed. And then, because Russia loves a sequel, 2 more false Dmitris showed up after that, each insisting they were the real one, not the other imposters. It was like a royal identity crisis stretched over a decade. And while historians generally agree the first Dmitri was a fraud, the fascinating part is that he could be believed at all. In an age without portraits, records, or reliable witnesses, you just had to look confident and say, "Yes, I'm that guy," and for a while, that was enough. The long con of Martin Guerre, but perhaps the most elegant case, and one of my personal favorites, is the story of Martin Guerre. He was a 16th century French peasant who disappeared from his village after being accused of stealing grain. Years later, a man showed up claiming to be Martin, older, wiser, and very sorry about the whole theft thing. He looked like Martin. He spoke like Martin. He knew intimate details about Martin's life, his farm, and even his wife, Bertrande. Everyone welcomed him back. For 3 years, he lived peacefully as Martin Guerre until the real Martin Guerre returned. You can imagine the confusion. The impostor, whose real name was Arnaud Dutil, was eventually exposed and executed. But the story fascinated Europe, because really, how could a village mistake a stranger for a man they'd known all their lives? The answer is simple. Memory is unreliable, and identity is fragile, especially in a world where proof meant little more than someone's word in a baptismal record no one could find. And there's something oddly comforting about that. The idea that before bureaucracy took over, a person could reinvent themselves completely, simply by walking into a room and saying, "Hello, remember me?" The church's awkward roll churches, incidentally, played a surprisingly large part in fake deaths. They were the record keepers of birth and death, and therefore the easiest institutions to manipulate. Santry, corrupt priest, could quietly enter a death into the parish book in exchange for a modest donation, or, if you needed to vanish more dramatically, an entire funeral could be staged. It happened often among the wealthy, especially those escaping scandal. A nobleman might hold a private burial, closed casket, naturally, while the supposedly deceased slipped away to the continent under an assumed name. Clergy were not always fooled, but they understood discretion, and, as one 17th-century priest dryly noted, "Charity covereth a multitude of sins, particularly those that come with gold. The rise of the professional impostor by the 18th and 19th centuries, with newspapers spreading faster than truth. Faking death became riskier, but also more theatrical. Some people made entire careers out of pretending to be dead men. After wars, impostors claiming to be lost heirs or missing soldiers would appear, often with suspiciously vague backstories. In the chaos after Napoleon's fall, Europe saw a wave of fake noblemen and resurrected officers, all seeking pensions or sympathy. The most famous was probably Karl Wilhelm Naundorff, a watchmaker who insisted he was Louis XVI, the child king who'd supposedly died in prison during the French Revolution. He was convincing enough to fool some of the late Queen's former servants. The quiet life of the hangman tonight. We're drifting back to a quieter corner of history, a place of flickering torchlight, cobbled streets, and the faint sound of bells marking another cold morning in the town square. And standing just off to the side, adjusting his gloves, perhaps yawning a little, is the man everyone is pretending not to look at. He's the executioner, a job so infamous that no one wanted to talk to him, yet everyone knew his name, because, of course, they did. But tonight, we're not here for the grisly part. We're here for the other hours of his day. The ones after the crowd went home, after the scaffold was taken down, when the executioner was just a man with a house and chores and probably some chickens, because for most of history, executioners had long stretches of ordinary time between their very unordinary duties. And what they did with that time is strangely human, and occasionally quite funny. So let's settle in, get comfortable, and drift back to meet the people whose job description included both public killing and please stay out of church. The town pariah, who everyone needed for most of medieval and early modern Europe. So c'est un pret parn fine forns. Executioners lived in a curious contradiction. They were outcasts, legally shunned, socially reviled, and yet also absolutely essential. Because someone had to do it. Someone had to swing the sword, turn the wheel, or light the pyre. And since respectable people weren't volunteering, cities began passing the role down through families, creating dynasties of hangmen. In Germany, these families became almost legendary. The Frances, the Reindels, the Grossenwalds. They lived on the edge of towns, often near the gallows, which, yes, made property values complicated. Their houses were technically city property, though no one ever tried to move in after them. And while everyone avoided them in public, in private, people found themselves knocking on the executioner's door surprisingly often, because hangmen had side jobs, many of them. The barber, the butcher, and the bone setter first, and, most famously, executioners were often healers. It sounds ironic, doesn't it? The man who broke bones on the wheel also fixed them afterward. But it made sense. Executioners were experts in anatomy. They knew where tendons ran, how joints worked, and which cuts bled fastest. That made them valuable. So in their spare time, they treated wounds, pulled teeth, and set fractures. Some even ran informal pharmacies, selling poultices and herbal remedies that they claimed could draw out corruption, which, to be fair, was basically the medieval version of antibiotics. They also practiced bloodletting, which doctors swore by at the time, and shaved people's heads for lice removal. Hence, the overlap with barbers, a profession only slightly more respectable. People wouldn't shake the executioner's hand in public, but when their leg was broken, suddenly that same hand looked very appealing. It's one of those beautifully awkward contradictions of history. The man banned from markets and taverns, yet regularly invited into homes to patch up dislocated shoulders. The sanitation department of doom executioners were also responsible for the less glamorous aspects of civic hygiene. They cleaned the streets after executions, yes, obviously, but also after battles, epidemics, and animal plagues. If a horse died in the road, the executioner's team dragged it away. If a pig went rabid, they were called to kill it. If someone found a corpse in the river, guess who fished it out? Essentially, they were the public sanitation officers of medieval towns, a grim kind of janitor, keeping death and disease at bay. Some cities even required executioners to clear out leper colonies, control stray dogs, and inspect food markets, all the disgusting jobs that no one else would do. They did them for a fee. And yet, if they dared to buy bread at the same stall as a respectable person, there would be outrage. It's hard not to see the hypocrisy there. Medieval society loved to outsource its filth, moral and literal, to the people it most despised. The side business of crime? Control executioners were also, oddly enough, law enforcement. In many cities, they were in charge of torture chambers, a grim but standardized part of pre-modern justice. They questioned prisoners, extracted confessions, and maintained the equipment. But after the interrogation ended, they had other duties, patrolling after curfew, chasing runaway debtors, escorting condemned men to their fate. And since these jobs often came with fees or bribes, many executioners quietly earned a decent living. A few even grew wealthy. In Nuremberg, the hangman Franz Schmidt kept an extraordinary diary in the late 1500s. He executed over 300 people during his career, but he also treated hundreds more for ailments and injuries. He carefully recorded every broken leg he reset, every abscess he drained, every drunk he hauled to jail. His notes are calm, neat, and strangely professional. He didn't seem to see himself as cruel or bloodthirsty. just necessary. A civil servant with a particularly unfortunate specialization. The problem of dinner parties socially. Of course, executioners were radioactive. They and their families were usually forbidden to eat or drink with citizens, marry outside their caste, or even sit near others in church. Children of hangmen had trouble finding spouses, unless it was with the children of other hangmen, which is how the profession quietly became hereditary. Even their servants were avoided. One 15th century law in Zurich stated that anyone who dined with an executioner could not serve as a juror for a year, so you can imagine that dinner parties were limited. Yet, despite their isolation, some hangmen became quietly respected. People feared them. Yes, but they also knew these men had power. After all, an executioner could delay a punishment, report a confession, or even recommend mercy. And a few clever ones used that influence strategically. Hangman's daughters. One of the oddest parts of executioner life involved their daughters, who, though shunned socially, were often described as beautiful and mysterious, which in pre-modern Europe was practically a business model. There's a whole subgenre of romantic literature about men falling in love with the hangman's daughter. Usually she's tragic, doomed, or saintly. But in reality, these women were pragmatic. Some married butchers or soldiers, others became midwives or healers themselves, and sometimes they helped with the family trade, preparing ropes, cleaning tools, managing the accounts. In 17th century Augsburg, the hangman's wife was technically his assistant, responsible for feeding prisoners and comforting the condemned, a job description that would make for a truly uncomfortable wedding. Toast. When business was slow, executioners were paid per job, which meant that in peaceful towns, or when crime rates dropped, they could fall on hard times. Some kept pigs or goats, some brewed beer, some became unofficial veterinarians, and some, like one hangman in Hamburg, operated taverns on the outskirts of town, where criminals and outcasts could drink without judgment, a kind of misfit pub run by the man who knew everyone's secrets. It's hard to imagine a more colorful clientele. Thieves, beggars, prostitutes, sailors, all drinking together, while the hangman himself polished his axe in the corner, quietly. Public relations. Medieval edition, because despite the stereotypes, many executioners did care about reputation. A botched execution was humiliating, not just for the condemned, but for the hangman's dignity. Too many bad swings, and he could be dismissed or fined. And since this was before performance reviews or HR departments, the only feedback came from the crowd's reaction. So executioners trained constantly. They practiced precision sword strikes on sheep carcasses, or sometimes condemned corpses to maintain their technique. A few were so skilled that they became famous, admired from a safe distance. Of course, they were, in a strange way, craftsmen, experts in anatomy and ceremony. Franz Schmidt, again, described his work as a calling, a divine burden placed upon him. He even signed official city documents, Franz Schmidt, by God's grace, executioner of Nuremberg. It sounds pompous, but perhaps it was a way to find peace in an impossible profession. The strange perks of the profession. For all the social stigma, there were small advantages. Executioners didn't pay taxes in many regions. They had free lodging, steady pay, and the right to claim old clothes and possessions of the executed. A grim kind of thrift shop. They also had legal immunity within their own walls. If a criminal fled into the hangman's house, it was considered a kind of sanctuary, a loophole that caused endless municipal headaches. And, oddly enough, executioners were among the few commoners allowed to carry swords openly within city limits. So even if no one wanted to sit next to them at church, no one messed with them on the street either. It's a peculiar balance of disgust and respect. People loathed them, right up until they needed them. The emotional side, you might wonder. Did they feel guilt? Did the work weigh on them? Some, yes. Others, apparently not much. Many saw themselves as tools of justice, not moral agents. Franz Schmidt's diary again gives us a rare glimpse. He occasionally mentioned pity for the condemned, especially for young offenders, and prayed for their souls after death. But he rarely expressed personal anguish. Perhaps he couldn't afford to. For the hangman, detachment was survival. If you felt too much, you wouldn't last. If you felt nothing, you became something else entirely.